The carbine weighed exactly 7 pounds and 4 ounces in Sergeant Maya Chen's hands, the same weight it had carried for the past 18 months of her military service. But on this scorching Tuesday morning at Fort Meridian's firing range, as Instructor Captain Bradley Hawkins reached across her shooting position to adjust her grip, the weapon felt like it carried the weight of every condescending comment, every dismissive glance, every moment she'd been told she didn't belong. Here, preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The desert heat shimmered off the concrete barriers, creating ghostly mirages that danced between the target markers at 50, 100, and 200 meters. Maya's olive green uniform stuck too. Her back, dark patches of sweat mapping the constellation of her frustration. Around her, 23 other soldiers, 22 men and 1 other woman. Private Lisa Rodriguez lined the shooting positions, their breathing controlled, their focus laser-sharp on the black silhouettes downrange. "You're gripping too." "Tight, Chun," Captain Hawkins said, his voice carrying that particular tone Maya had come to recognize, the one that sounded helpful on the surface but carried an undercurrent of doubt, as if he were speaking to a child who'd picked up daddy's tools. His fingers wrapped around hers on the carbine's grip, unnecessarily close, unnecessarily lingering. "Women always grip too tight. It's an emotional thing." Maya's jaw tightened. In the peripheral vision of her left eye, she caught Private Rodriguez, shooting her a knowing look, the kind of silent communication that passed between the only 2 women in Charlie Company's advanced marksmanship program. They'd learned to speak in glances, in barely perceptible nods, in the shared understanding of what it meant to excel in a space that constantly questioned your right to be there. The firing range stretched before them, like a concrete canyon, its walls rising 15 feet on either side, designed to contain both bullets and the echoing reports of gunfire that would soon fill the morning air. Behind the shooting line, a wooden observation deck held a handful of officers, clipboards in hand, evaluating each soldier's performance with the clinical detachment of scientists studying specimens. Among them stood Colonel Patricia Reeves, the base's highest-ranking female officer, her silver hair pulled back in a regulation, bun that caught the harsh sunlight like polished metal. Maya had grown up in her grandmother's house in Sacramento, where the walls were covered with black and white photographs of women who'd served in wars that officially didn't allow them in combat roles. Her grandmother, Maya Chen, had worked in munitions factories during World War II, her delicate hands assembling the very bullets that soldiers like Maya now fired downrange. "Mia," Alina used to say in her weathered voice that carried traces of both Spanish and Mandarin, "sometimes the world tells you that you're not strong enough, not fast enough, not good enough. But your hands know the truth, even when your mind forgets." Those hands now held the M4 carbine with a steadiness that 18 months of training had forged into muscle memory. Maya's marksmanship scores ranked in the top 5% of her training class. Her weapons maintenance evaluations were consistently perfect, and her physical fitness scores exceeded the male standards, not just the female ones. Yet here was Captain Hawkins, treating her like she was handling a firearm for the first time. "I've been shooting since I was 12, sir," Maya said, her voice steady despite the heat building behind her sternum. "My grandfather taught me on his ranch in Modesto. I know how to hold a rifle." Captain Hawkins chuckled, a sound like gravel shifting in a bucket. "Hunting rabbits with your granddaddy's .22 isn't quite the same as combat marksmanship, sweetheart. This isn't a county fair shooting gallery." The word "sweetheart" landed like a slap. Around her, Maya felt the subtle shift in attention as other soldiers registered the exchange. Some looked uncomfortable, their gazes dropping to their weapons or drifting toward the targets downrange. Others seemed to lean in slightly, as if sensing the electricity building in the air between their instructor and the sergeant, who'd outscored most of them on every qualification test. Private Tommy Matsuda, positioned 2 spots to Maya's right, cleared his throat softly. Tommy had grown up in the same Central California farming communities as Maya, and they'd formed a quiet friendship built on shared experiences of being underestimated, him for his slight build and quiet demeanor, her for reasons that were becoming increasingly obvious. Sergeant Chun's got the highest scores in the company. "Sir," he said, his voice carefully neutral but carrying just enough emphasis to make his point clear. "Scores on paper don't mean much when the lead starts flying, Private," Captain Hawkins replied without looking at Tommy, his attention still focused on Maya's hands with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Real combat is about instinct, about muscle memory, about having the balls to pull the trigger when it counts." The phrase hung in the desert air like smoke. Maya felt something crystallize inside her chest, a cold clarity that cut through the heat and the frustration and the 18 months of accumulated indignities. She'd been raised by strong women who'd taught her to choose her battles carefully, to endure what couldn't be changed and fight what couldn't be endured. But there were lines that, once crossed, revealed the true landscape of a person's character. "Sir," Maya said, her voice dropping to a register that made several nearby soldiers look up from their weapons, "I'd like to request permission to demonstrate proper marksmanship technique for the company." Captain Hawkins straightened, his eyebrows rising. At 6'2", with the broad shoulders of a former college linebacker, he towered over Maya's 5'6" frame. But something in her tone made him take a half-step backward. "What exactly are you suggesting, Sergeant?" "Standard qualification course, sir. 16 rounds, multiple targets, multiple distances. If my technique is as flawed as you suggest, it should show in the results." Maya's voice carried across the firing line with the clear authority of someone who'd found their moment of truth. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer to keep coaching me through it." The challenge was unmistakable, wrapped in the formal language of military protocol, but carrying the unmistakable edge of a line drawn in sand. Colonel Reeves stepped forward on the observation deck, her attention now fully focused on the drama unfolding at position 7. The other instructors exchanged glances, sensing the shift in atmosphere that preceded either spectacular failure or redemption. Hawkins' face flushed red beneath his desert tan. "You think you're some kind of Annie Oakley, Chun? You think 18 months of training makes you an expert marksman?" "No, sir," Maya replied, her grip on the carbine shifting slightly as she settled into her shooting stance. "I think 18 months of training, combined with 10 years of shooting experience and consistently superior scores, makes me competent enough to hold my weapon without assistance." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of a helicopter, conducting training exercises somewhere beyond the mountain ridge that bordered the base. Maya could feel the weight of 23 pairs of eyes on her, could sense the held breath of soldiers who recognized the electric moment that precedes either breakdown or breakthrough. Private Rodriguez caught Maya's eye and gave the smallest possible nod, a gesture of solidarity that carried the weight of every woman who'd ever had to prove herself twice as hard for half the recognition. Tommy Matsuda adjusted his own grip on his weapon, unconsciously mimicking Maya's stance in a show of quiet support. Captain Hawkins looked around the firing line, seeming to realize that his authority was being challenged not just by one female sergeant, but by the subtle shifting of loyalties that happened when leadership crossed the line from instruction to humiliation. He'd miscalculated, pushed too far, and now found himself in the position of either backing down or doubling down on a confrontation he hadn't intended to start. "Fine," he said, his voice tight with the kind of anger that comes from being cornered. "By one's own words, show us what you've got, Sergeant. But when you choke under pressure, don't say I didn't try to help you." Maya nodded once, a sharp motion that carried no trace of gratitude or deference. She stepped fully into her shooting position, her boots finding the worn marks on the concrete where countless soldiers had stood before her. The carbine came up to her shoulder with the fluid motion of someone who'd performed this action thousands of times. In training exercises and live-fire drills, in the pre-dawn darkness of guard duty, and the blazing heat of desert afternoons. As she settled into her stance, Maya felt the familiar quieting that came with perfect focus. The world narrowed to the iron sights aligned with the target's downrange, to the rhythm of her breathing, to the steady beat of her heart that she'd learned to time with the squeeze of the trigger. This was the space where all the noise fell away, the doubts, the frustrations, the constant need to prove herself worthy of standing alongside soldiers who'd never had their competence questioned because of their gender. The first target stood 50 meters away, a black silhouette stark against the tan backdrop of the desert range. Maya's breathing slowed to a measured cadence, her heartbeat marking time like a metronome. She'd fired this course dozens of times, but never with 23 witnesses and a captain who just challenged not only her marksmanship, but her right to wear the uniform that had become her second skin. Behind her, she could hear Captain Hawkins muttering something to another instructor, his voice carrying the edge of a man who'd backed himself into a corner and was looking for a way to save face. But the sound faded into the background noise of wind and distant engines, irrelevant compared to the conversation happening between Maya and the targets that waited in the desert heat. What Captain Hawkins didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Maya Chen had been having conversations with targets for most of her life. In her grandfather's orchard, she'd talked to tin cans balanced on fence posts while he taught her to shoot rabbits that threatened his crops. At the county fair, she'd whispered to paper bullseyes while teenage boys made comments about girls playing with guns. In basic training, she'd found solace in the honest simplicity of marksmanship, a discipline where results spoke louder than assumptions. The carbine in her hands held more than bullets. It carried the weight of her grandmother's stories about women who'd built bombers and packed parachutes while men flew off to war. It held the memory of her mother's quiet strength, working double shifts as a nurse to put Maya through college. It contained the hopes of every girl who'd ever been told that some dreams weren't meant for people like her. As Maya settled into her final aiming position, a strange calm descended over the firing line. Even Captain Hawkins had fallen silent, perhaps sensing that he was about to witness something that would be talked about in the company for years to come. The desert wind stilled, as if the landscape itself was holding its breath. Maya's finger found the trigger, and in that moment of perfect stillness, she realized that this wasn't just about marksmanship anymore. This was about every woman who'd ever been underestimated, every soldier who'd been judged by someone else's limitations rather than their own capabilities. This was about proving that competence couldn't be measured by the volume of someone's voice or the assumptions they carried about who belonged in uniform. The first shot would either vindicate 18 months of preparation or confirm Captain Hawkins' prejudices. But as Maya's world narrowed to the simple equation of sight alignment and trigger control, she felt something her grandmother had tried to teach her years ago in that Sacramento kitchen, surrounded by photographs of forgotten heroes. Sometimes, the most powerful statement you can make is the one spoken in the language of undeniable results. The question that hung in the desert air, shimmering like heat mirages above the concrete, wasn't whether Maya Chen could hit her targets. The question was what would happen to Captain Hawkins. Assumptions when she did that. Maya had learned to wake up at 0445 hours, not because regulations demanded it, but because those extra 15 minutes before reveille belonged entirely to her. In the gray pre-dawn darkness of Barrack C, while 20 other soldiers still lost themselves in dreams of home, she would lie on her narrow bunk and run through her daily mental checklist, not the official one that governed military life, but the personal inventory that kept her grounded in a world that constantly tested her sense of belonging. The barracks smelled like a mixture of industrial disinfectant, worn leather boots, and the lingering traces of whatever instant coffee Private Kowalski had brewed too strong the night before. Maya's bunk was positioned near the window, A spot she'd claimed not for the view, which consisted mainly of the motor pool and another, identical barracks building, but for the thin sliver of natural light that would creep through the Venetian blinds each morning, marking the transition from night shift to day shift, from private thoughts to public performance. Her footlocker sat at the end of the bunk. Regulation olive drab with her name stenciled in black letters, Chen, MSGT. Inside, beneath the precisely folded uniforms and polished boots that satisfied even the most demanding inspection, she kept a small wooden box that her grandmother had given her the day before she shipped out to basic training. The box contained 3 items: a photograph of her mother in nursing scrubs, smiling despite the exhaustion in her eyes, a letter from her younger brother David, written on notebook paper and filled with spelling mistakes and promises to write more often, and a small silver medal that had belonged to her great-aunt Rose, who'd served as a combat medic in Vietnam during an era when women weren't supposed to be anywhere near the fighting. Maya would hold that medal for exactly 30 seconds each morning, feeling the weight of its tarnished silver and thinking about the women who'd worn uniforms before her. Rose had died when Maya was 12, but not before telling her stories about treating wounded soldiers in field hospitals, about earning respect one patient at a time, about learning that strength came in forms that couldn't always be measured by physical standards. "You know what the hardest part was, Mia?" Rose had said during one of their last conversations, her voice weakened by the cancer that would claim her 6 months later. "It wasn't the blood or the fear or the long hours. It was convincing people, every single day, that I deserved to be there. Even when I saved their lives, some of them looked at me like I was playing dress-up in someone else's uniform." Those words echoed in Maya's mind as she laced her combat boots each morning, as she stood in formation while Sergeant First Class Morrison called roll, as she navigated the complex social dynamics of a unit where she was simultaneously accepted as a soldier and questioned as a woman. The contradiction lived in her daily routine like a persistent low-grade fever, present enough to notice, but not debilitating enough to stop her from functioning. Breakfast in the dining facility was a carefully choreographed social dance. Maya had learned to time her arrival for 0630 hours, early enough to avoid the rush but late enough that she wouldn't be eating alone. She'd claim a seat at the table where Tommy Matsuda and Private Rodriguez usually sat, along with a rotating cast of soldiers who'd formed an informal alliance of the underestimated, the quiet ones, the smart ones, the ones who excelled at their jobs, but didn't fit the traditional mold of military swagger. The dining facility buzzed with the particular energy of soldiers preparing for another day of training. Conversations ranged from complaints about the previous day's equipment maintenance to speculation about upcoming deployments, from updates on family news from home to debates about which action movie most accurately portrayed military life. Conversation that invariably devolved into arguments and laughter in equal measure. Maya would eat her scrambled eggs and wheat toast while listening to these conversations, contributing when appropriate, but mainly observing the social ecosystem that governed military life. She'd learned that her opinions carried different weight depending on the topic. Soldiers respected her expertise on weapons and tactics, but some still seemed surprised when she demonstrated knowledge about sports or mechanical repair, or any subject outside the narrow categories they'd unconsciously assigned to female soldiers. "Chun, you follow baseball?" Specialist Jackson would ask, genuinely curious, but with the tone of someone discovering an unexpected talent in a coworker. "Giants fan since I was 7, Maya would reply, and then spend the next 10 minutes discussing pitching rotations and batting averages with the same precision she brought to discussing ammunition types and ballistic trajectories. The surprise in Jackson's eyes would gradually give way to respect, but she noticed that this conversation would need to happen again in a few weeks with a different soldier about a different topic, as if her competence in one area couldn't automatically transfer to assumptions about her competence in others. After breakfast, Maya's day would shift into the rhythm of military training. Physical fitness at 0730, where she'd consistently score above the male standards on push-ups, sit-ups, and the 2-mile run. Her running pace had been honed on the hills around her childhood home in California, where weekend jogs with her mother had evolved into competitive races against herself, always trying to shave another 10 seconds off her time, always pushing the boundaries of what her 5'6" frame could accomplish. During PT, Maya would find herself simultaneously trying to excel and trying not to excel too visibly. She'd learned that finishing first in every exercise drew attention that wasn't always positive. Some soldiers cheered her achievements, while others seemed to interpret her success as a challenge to their own capabilities. The balance required constant recalibration, perform well enough to maintain her reputation as a competent soldier, but not so well that she became a target for resentment. The most complicated part of this balance played out in the weight room, where Maya had developed a strength training routine that maximized her natural athletic ability while working within the biological realities of her frame. She could bench press 185 pounds, squat 250, and deadlift 300 numbers. That would have been impressive in any civilian gym, but placed her in the middle range of her military unit. Some soldiers respected the work ethic these numbers represented, while others seemed disappointed that she couldn't outlift men who outweighed her by 60 pounds. Not bad for a girl, Corporal Williams had said after watching her complete a set of bench presses, and Maya had bitten back her first 3 responses in favor of a simple, "Thank you, Corporal," delivered in a tone that acknowledged the comment, while subtly suggesting that it missed the point. These microaggressions accumulated like small stones in her BOOTS, individually insignificant, but collectively creating a persistent discomfort that required constant attention. Maya had developed strategies for dealing with them: deflection with humor, redirection toward professional topics, or simply the patient endurance that her mother had modeled during long shifts in understaffed emergency rooms. But it was during weapons training that Maya felt most completely herself, most aligned with the soldier she'd trained to become. The firing range was a place of objective measurement, where results spoke with mathematical clarity that transcended opinions and assumptions. A target hit was a target hit, regardless of who pulled the trigger. A score was a score, regardless of the gender of the marksman who earned it. Maya's afternoon routine centered around weapons maintenance and marksmanship practice. She would arrive at the armory early, before the scheduled training began, and spend extra time cleaning and inspecting her assigned carbine. The weapon had become an extension of her identity as a soldier. She knew the serial number by heart, could disassemble and reassemble it in complete darkness, had fired thousands of rounds through its barrel and adjusted the sights to account for her personal shooting style. Other soldiers would sometimes express surprise at the meticulous care she devoted to equipment maintenance. "Chun treats that rifle like it's made of gold," she'd heard Specialist Patterson say, not mockingly but with the tone of someone observing an interesting phenomenon. What they didn't understand was that the carbine represented something more than just military equipment to Maya. It was proof of her competence in the most fundamental skill of military service, a tool that responded to expertise rather than assumptions. During these quiet afternoons in the armory, Maya would sometimes find herself thinking about the trajectory that had brought her to Fort Meridian. She'd enlisted immediately after college, despite a degree in engineering that could have led to a lucrative civilian career. Her parents had worried about the decision, her mother especially concerned about the physical and social challenges Maya would face as a woman in the military. "Mia, you don't have to prove anything to anyone," her mother had said during their last conversation before Maya left for basic training. "You're already strong, already smart, already everything you need to be." But Maya had tried to explain that joining the military wasn't about proving something to others. It was about proving something to herself. She wanted to test her capabilities in an environment that demanded excellence, to serve something larger than her individual ambitions, to carry forward the legacy of women like her great-aunt Rose, who'd carved out space for future generations in traditionally male-dominated fields. The reality of military life had been both harder and more rewarding than she'd anticipated. The physical demands pushed her body to limits she hadn't known existed. The mental challenges required constant adaptation and learning. The social dynamics demanded a level of emotional intelligence that wasn't covered in any training manual, but it was the small moments of acceptance and camaraderie that sustained her through the difficulties. Tommy Masuda asking for her advice on improving his shooting stance. Private Rodriguez confiding her own struggles with feeling like an outsider. Colonel Reeves stopping by the firing range to observe training and nodding approvingly at Maya's performance. Sergeant First Class Morrison including her in planning discussions for upcoming exercises, treating her expertise as valuable rather than surprising. These moments of recognition felt like deposits in an emotional bank account that Maya drew from during the more challenging times. When Captain Hawkins made comments about emotional shooting styles, she remembered Colonel Reeves' respectful nod. When other soldiers seemed surprised by her mechanical knowledge, she thought about Tommy asking for her help with his carbine malfunction. When the accumulated weight of constant evaluation threatened to overwhelm her, she focused on Private Rodriguez's quiet gratitude for having another woman in the unit. Maya's evening routine provided a space for processing the complex emotions that military life generated. After dinner and evening formation, she would often find herself in the base library, a small building that stayed open until 2100 hours and provided a quiet refuge from the constant social dynamics of barracks life. She would read everything from military history to engineering journals to novels that transported her temporarily away from Fort Meridian and back to the civilian world she'd left behind. During these evening hours, Maya would sometimes write letters home that she never sent, long detailed accounts of her daily experiences that helped her process the contradiction of feeling simultaneously proud of her service and frustrated by the constant need to prove her worthiness to serve. These unsent letters became a private journal, where she could express doubts and fears that had no place in her public persona as a competent soldier. Dear Mom, one such letter began, "Today a captain told me that women always grip their weapons too emotionally. Right before I outshot every other soldier in the company. I wanted to tell him that emotion isn't the opposite of competence. That caring deeply about doing something well is actually what makes you good at it. But instead I just nodded and said, 'Yes, sir,' and saved my real response for the target's downrange. I think you'd be proud of my restraint. Or maybe disappointed that I didn't speak up more directly. I'm still figuring out which battles are worth fighting and which ones are worth winning through quiet excellence." These letters revealed the internal complexity that Maya carried beneath her professional exterior. She was simultaneously confident in her abilities and uncertain about her place in the military hierarchy. She was proud of her achievements and frustrated by the extra effort required to earn recognition that seemed to come more easily to her male counterparts. She loved the challenge of military service and resented the additional challenge of constantly proving that she deserved to be challenged in the first place. The contradiction created a constant, low-level tension that influenced every interaction, every decision, every moment of her military service. Maya had learned to manage this tension through discipline, preparation, and the kind of patient endurance that her grandmother had modeled while working in munitions factories during World War II. But managing tension wasn't the same as resolving it, and Maya carried the accumulated weight of 18 months of careful navigation through a social landscape that viewed her as both soldier and anomaly. As she lay in her bunk each night, listening to the sounds of 20 other soldiers settling into sleep, Maya would run through her mental inventory one more time. She would catalog the day's small victories and minor defeats, adjust her strategies for tomorrow's challenges, and remind herself that her service wasn't just about proving that women could be soldiers. It was about proving that the military was stronger when it embraced the full range of human capability rather than limiting itself to traditional assumptions about who belonged in uniform. The question that followed her into sleep wasn't whether she was tough enough for military life. 18 months of consistent performance had answered that definitively. The question was whether military culture was flexible enough to recognize that strength came in forms that didn't always match the historical model of the ideal soldier, and whether institutions built on tradition could adapt quickly enough to embrace soldiers who brought new perspectives to ancient challenges. Tomorrow would bring another day of navigation through this complex landscape, another opportunity to demonstrate competence while managing the social dynamics that made competence more complicated than it should have been. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of Barrack C, Maya Chen allowed herself 30 seconds of unguarded honesty. She was exactly where she wanted to be, serving exactly as she dreamed of serving, but the cost of belonging had been higher than she'd anticipated when she first raised her right hand and swore to defend the Constitution. The silver medal in her footlocker caught a thin beam of moonlight through the Venetian blinds, and Maya whispered the same quiet prayer her great-aunt Rose had taught her years earlier. Grant me the strength to endure what I cannot change, the courage to change what I cannot endure, and the wisdom to know the difference. Tomorrow would test all three. The morning after Captain Hawkins' comment about emotional shooting styles, Maya arrived at the firing range to find her carbine had been reassigned to another soldier. The weapons roster posted outside the armory showed her name next to serial number 7749, a rifle she'd never seen before, one with a loose stock misaligned sights, and a particular smell that indicated inadequate maintenance by its previous user. Administrative error, Sergeant. Master Sergeant Davis explained when Maya questioned the change, his tone carrying the neutral efficiency of someone delivering information he didn't necessarily agree with. Captain Hawkins wanted to rotate equipment assignments to ensure everyone gets experience with different weapons. Maya examined the unfamiliar carbine with the methodical attention she'd learned from her grandfather. The bolt didn't seat properly. The trigger pull was inconsistent. The barrel showed signs of copper fouling that would affect accuracy. In civilian life, she would have simply selected a different rifle. In military life, she was expected to adapt to whatever equipment she was assigned and still perform to the same standards. How long do I have to prepare this weapon for qualification, Master Sergeant? Maya asked, already calculating the hours of maintenance required to bring the rifle to acceptable condition. Same as everyone else, Sergeant. Qualification starts at 08:00. 2 hours to diagnose, clean, and sight adjust a weapon that should have been properly maintained months ago. Maya felt the familiar sensation of the mountain growing higher, just as she was preparing to climb it, but she nodded once and carried the problematic carbine to the maintenance station. Private Rodriguez appeared at her shoulder. That's the rifle Patterson turned in last month, she said quietly. He complained about it for weeks before they finally let him switch to a different one. Why wasn't it repaired? Maya asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Repair order got lost in the paperwork, Rodriguez replied, but her tone suggested they both understood that paperwork had a tendency to get lost when it became convenient for certain people. Maya spent the next 90 minutes performing intensive maintenance on the carbine, using every technique her grandfather had taught her about reviving neglected firearms. She cleaned the barrel with solvent and brushes until the copper fouling disappeared. She adjusted the trigger mechanism to eliminate the inconsistent pull. She shimmed the loose stock and realigned the sights using a process that required patience, precision, and the kind of mechanical intuition that came from years of working with her hands. Other soldiers watched her work with expressions that ranged from admiration to confusion. Specialist Jackson paused at her workstation to observe the meticulous process of rifle restoration. "Chen, you could just request a different weapon, right?" he said. "Nobody expects you to turn that piece of junk into a competition rifle in 2 hours." "I'll make it work," Maya replied without looking up from the sight adjustment she was performing. What she didn't say was that requesting a different weapon would be interpreted as an admission that she couldn't handle challenging equipment. Confirmation that women needed special accommodations to perform at the same level as men. Tommy Matsuda understood the subtext. He brought Maya a cup of coffee and sat beside her while she worked, not offering to help, but simply providing the kind of quiet companionship that acknowledged the unfairness of the situation without drawing additional attention to it. "Remember that time in 8 when they gave you the broken radio for the communication exercise?" Tommy said, referring to advanced individual training where they'd first met. "You rewired the whole thing during the night movement and still completed the mission faster than anyone else." "That radio actually worked when I fixed it," Maya replied with a slight smile. "This rifle might just explode when I fire it." But the rifle didn't explode. When qualification began at 0800 hours, Maya's hastily repaired carbine performed with mechanical precision that bordered on the miraculous. Her first 3 shots at the 50-meter target clustered within a 2-inch group, close enough to prove that her emergency maintenance had been successful, but not quite perfect enough to silence the skeptics who'd been hoping for visible failure. Captain Hawkins observed her performance through binoculars, his expression unreadable but his posture suggesting disappointment rather than satisfaction with her competence. After Maya completed her qualification run with a score of 38 out of 40, missing perfect by 2 points that could reasonably be attributed to equipment limitations, he approached her position with the measured stride of someone who'd prepared for this conversation. "Interesting shooting, Sergeant Chen," he said, his voice carrying a tone that somehow made a compliment sound like an accusation. "Though I notice your groupings weren't quite as tight as usual. Perhaps that emotional grip issue is becoming more pronounced under stress." Maya felt something crystallize in her chest, not anger, which would have been counterproductive, but a cold clarity about the nature of the game being played around her. No matter how well she performed, the interpretation of her performance would be filtered through pre-existing assumptions about her limitations. Success would be attributed to luck or favorable conditions. Failure would be evidence of inherent weakness. "Sir, I was assigned a different rifle this morning," Maya replied, her voice carefully neutral. "I spent the available time bringing it to functional condition, but optimal accuracy requires familiarity with specific equipment characteristics. A good soldier adapts to any equipment, Sergeant." Making excuses about weapons assignments suggests a mentality that prioritizes comfort over performance. The accusation hit like a physical blow, not because it contained any truth, but because it revealed the impossibility of Maya's position. If she performed well with substandard equipment, her achievement would be minimized. If she performed poorly, it would confirm assumptions about her competence. If she complained about equipment quality, she would be labeled as someone who made excuses. If she didn't complain, she would be expected to achieve the same results, regardless of the obstacles placed in her path. Around her, Maya sensed other soldiers absorbing this exchange with varying degrees of discomfort. Some seemed oblivious to the underlying dynamics, accepting Captain Hawkins' critique at face value. Others, including Tommy and Rodriguez, showed subtle signs of recognition that they were witnessing something more complex than standard military instruction. Colonel Reeves had positioned herself at the observation deck throughout the mornings. Qualification. And Maya noticed that the colonel's attention seemed focused, not just on the shooting performance, but on the interactions between instructors and students. When Captain Hawkins finished his critique and moved on to evaluate other soldiers, Colonel Reeves made a note on her clipboard, that seemed longer than necessary for a simple performance assessment. The afternoon brought a new challenge, disguised as routine training. Captain Hawkins announced that the company would participate in a combat simulation exercise, where soldiers would be paired with partners for mutual support and evaluation. The partnerships would be randomly assigned, he explained, to ensure that soldiers learn to work effectively with any teammate. Maya found herself partnered with Corporal Bradley Stevens, a soldier whose competence was matched only by his vocal opinions about women in combat roles. Stevens had never been directly insubordinate, but he had a talent for expressing skepticism through body language and strategically placed comments that skirted the edge of official misconduct. "Looks like we're stuck together, Chen," Stevens said as they prepared for the exercise. "Hope you can keep up when things get real." The combat simulation involved a series of tactical movements through a mock urban environment, with instructors playing the role of enemy forces and evaluating each partnership's ability to communicate, coordinate, and complete objectives under pressure. Maya and Stevens were assigned to clear a building complex and secure a high-value target, a scenario that required trust, timing, and seamless cooperation between partners. From the beginning, Stevens seemed more interested in demonstrating his individual capabilities than in supporting their shared mission. He would move ahead without signaling his intentions, leave Maya to cover approaches that required two soldiers, and communicate using hand signals that deviated from standard protocols, forcing her to guess his plans, rather than respond to clear direction. During the third phase of the exercise, Stevens' grandstanding nearly resulted in disaster. He advanced on a doorway without waiting for Maya's covering fire, triggering a simulated ambush that should have been easily avoided with proper coordination. The blank ammunition used in the exercise couldn't cause physical harm, but the instructor's evaluation would certainly note the tactical failure that Stevens' impatience had created. "Damn it, Chen, where was my cover?" Stevens demanded after the instructors called a halt to reset the scenario. "I thought you were supposed to be some kind of expert marksman." The accusation was particularly unfair because Maya had been positioned exactly where Stevens should have expected, covering the angle he'd agreed to during their pre-mission briefing. His deviation from the plan had left her unable to provide effective support, but he was attempting to shift responsibility for the failure onto her performance. Maya felt the familiar tension building in her shoulders, the physical manifestation of frustration that threatened to spill over into words that would only make the situation worse. She was trapped in a dynamic where Stevens' mistakes became her responsibility, where his inability to work as part of a team would be interpreted as evidence of her inability to earn the respect necessary for effective partnership. "Corporal." Stevens moved ahead of the planned position, Maya said, addressing her comments to the evaluating instructor rather than to Stevens directly. "I maintained cover on the agreed approach, but couldn't provide support when he advanced through a different doorway." Sergeant First Class Morrison, who was observing the exercise, nodded in acknowledgement of Maya's explanation, but didn't offer any correction of Stevens' behavior. The implicit message was clear. Maya was expected to adapt to Stevens' leadership style, regardless of whether that style followed established protocols or created unnecessary risks. The pattern continued through the remaining phases of the exercise. Stevens would make tactical decisions without consultation, expect Maya to compensate for the gaps his choices created, and then critique her performance when the lack of coordination led to predictable problems. By the time they completed the final objective, Maya felt like she'd been fighting two battles simultaneously, one against the simulated enemy forces and another against a partner who seemed more interested in proving her inadequacy than in accomplishing their shared mission. Captain Hawkins conducted the after-action review with the clinical detachment of someone dissecting a failed experiment. He praised Stevens for his aggressive initiative and decisive leadership, while noting that Maya's hesitant support had created coordination problems that undermined the team's effectiveness. In combat, Sergeant Chen, hesitation kills. Captain Hawkins concluded, "Your partner can't succeed if you're second-guessing every decision instead of providing immediate support." Maya bit back her first response, which would have pointed out that Stephen's decisions had deviated from their agreed plan and military doctrine in ways that would have gotten them both killed in actual combat. Instead, she nodded and accepted the critique with the stoic professionalism that had become her default response to situations where defending herself would only make things worse. But Tommy Matsuda had witnessed the entire exercise, and after the formal review concluded, he approached Maya with the kind of controlled anger that suggested he'd been cataloging injustices for months. "That was complete bullshit, Maya," he said quietly, using her first name in a way that emphasized the personal nature of his support. "Stevens ignored every protocol you two agreed on, and somehow that becomes your fault because you didn't read his mind?" "It doesn't matter, Tommy," Maya replied, though her voice carried a weariness that suggested she was beginning to question whether that statement was entirely true. "The evaluation is what it is. I'll adapt better next time." "How do you adapt?" "To someone who won't follow the plan?" Tommy asked. "How do you provide covering fire for someone who doesn't tell you where they're going?" The questions hung in the air between them, highlighting the impossible mathematics of Maya's situation. She was expected to excel within systems that were designed around assumptions about her limitations, to succeed despite obstacles that weren't acknowledged as obstacles, to prove her competence through performances that would be interpreted through the lens of pre-existing skepticism about her capabilities. The next morning brought news that would elevate these individual incidents into something approaching a systematic pattern. Captain Hawkins announced that the company would participate in a comprehensive evaluation exercise designed to identify candidates for advanced training opportunities, including slots in specialized programs that could accelerate career advancement and increase opportunities for leadership roles. The evaluation would span a full week and include assessments of marksmanship, physical fitness, tactical knowledge, leadership potential, and the mysterious quality that military evaluators called bearing, a combination of confidence, presence, and the indefinable characteristics that supposedly indicated a soldier's potential for greater responsibilities. Maya knew that her objective qualifications positioned her as a strong candidate for selection. Her marksmanship scores consistently ranked in the top 5%. Her physical fitness evaluations exceeded male standards. Her written examinations on tactics and military doctrine had earned perfect or near-perfect scores. But she also understood that bearing was a subjective evaluation that could be influenced by evaluators' preconceptions about what leadership looked like. The announcement created a buzz of excitement and anxiety throughout the company. Soldiers began strategizing about how to maximize their performance during each phase of evaluation. Study groups formed to review tactical scenarios. Physical training sessions intensified as soldiers pushed themselves to achieve their peak fitness levels. Maya found herself navigating a complex social dynamic around these preparation activities. Some soldiers welcomed her participation in study groups, recognizing that her knowledge could help everyone perform better. Others seemed uncomfortable with the idea of receiving instruction from a female sergeant, even when her expertise clearly exceeded their own. During one evening study session focused on urban combat tactics, Maya offered an analysis of a complex scenario that demonstrated both theoretical knowledge and practical insight gained from months of training exercises. Her explanation was clear, detailed, and accurate, the kind of instruction that would have been received enthusiastically if it had come from a male sergeant with equivalent qualifications. Instead, Specialist Patterson responded with the kind of comment that had become frustratingly familiar. "That's an interesting theory, Chun, but I wonder how it would work when you're actually getting shot at." The implication was that Maya's knowledge was purely academic, that her understanding of tactics couldn't be trusted because it hadn't been tested under real, conditions, despite the fact that none of the soldiers in the room had experienced actual combat, and Maya's performance in training exercises had consistently demonstrated her ability to apply theoretical knowledge under simulated stress. Private Rodriguez, who had been quietly absorbing the group's dynamics, finally spoke up with the kind of directness that cut through diplomatic evasion. Specialist Patterson, how many leave-fire exercises have you completed, compared to Sergeant Chen? The question highlighted the absurdity of Patterson's critique. Maya had participated in more training exercises, fired more rounds downrange, and demonstrated superior performance in every measurable category of military competence. Yet Patterson's skepticism was accepted as reasonable, while Maya's expertise was treated as unproven theory. Tommy Matsuda, who had been following the conversation with increasing frustration, added his own observation. Maybe we should focus on learning from the person who consistently scores highest instead of questioning whether she knows what she's talking about. The study session continued, but the underlying tension remained. Maya found herself in the position of having to prove her credibility repeatedly, even when discussing subjects where her superior performance was documented and undeniable. Each question she answered correctly was met with surprised acknowledgement rather than expected respect. Each insight she offered was evaluated with the kind of skepticism that her male counterparts didn't face when sharing their own tactical knowledge. As the week of evaluation approached, these individual incidents began to coalesce into a pattern that Maya could no longer dismiss as coincidence or personality conflicts. The substandard equipment assignments, the biased performance critiques, the systematic undermining of her credibility. Taken individually, each incident could be explained as normal military life. Taken collectively, they suggested something more deliberate. Maya began documenting these incidents in the letters she wrote home, but never sent, creating a private record of experiences that would have seemed unbelievable if described to someone unfamiliar with the subtle ways that institutional bias could manifest itself. Dear Mom, she wrote one evening, today I was told that my tactical knowledge is interesting theory by someone who scores 20 points lower than me on every written examination. Yesterday, my rifle was reassigned to someone else right before qualification. Last week, my partner in the combat exercise ignored our agreed plan and then blamed me when his improvisation failed. Individually, these things could be explained away. Together, they feel like death by 1,000 small cuts. The unsent letter continued. The hardest part isn't the obvious stuff, the comments about emotional shooting or the surprise when I know something about sports or mechanics. The hardest part is the subtle stuff that makes me question my own perceptions. Am I being too sensitive? Am I imagining patterns that don't exist? Or am I experiencing exactly what Aunt Rose warned me about, the constant need to prove that I deserve to wear the same uniform as everyone else? Maya's internal struggle was complicated by the fact that she genuinely loved military service. She found purpose in the mission, satisfaction in the technical challenges, and pride in wearing the uniform that connected her to generations of Americans who had chosen to serve something larger than themselves. But loving something that didn't seem to love her back created a cognitive dissonance that required constant emotional management. The contradiction was most apparent during moments of genuine camaraderie, when the barriers would temporarily dissolve and she would feel fully accepted as a soldier among soldiers. These moments, sharing a laugh with Tommy over breakfast, receiving a respectful nod from Colonel Reeves after a successful training exercise, working alongside Rodriguez to help a struggling soldier improve their marksmanship, reminded Maya why she had enlisted and why she wanted to continue serving. But these positive moments were always shadowed by the awareness that acceptance was conditional and fragile. A single mistake would be magnified beyond proportion. A single moment of weakness would be interpreted as evidence of inherent limitations. A single display of emotion would confirm stereotypes about women's unsuitability for military service. Maya carried this awareness like a weight that influenced every decision, every interaction, every moment of her military career. She had to be better than good enough, had to maintain perfect composure under imperfect conditions, had to excel despite obstacles that weren't acknowledged as obstacles by the people evaluating her. Performance. As the comprehensive evaluation week approached, Maya understood that she was facing more than just another training exercise. She was confronting a test of whether merit could overcome assumption, whether documented competence could supersede institutional bias, whether 18 months of superior performance could earn her the same opportunities that would be automatically available to male soldiers with equivalent qualifications. The stakes extended beyond her individual career. Maya recognized that her performance during this evaluation would influence how future female soldiers would be perceived and treated. Success would crack open doors for others. Failure would provide ammunition for those who argued that women couldn't handle the demands of advanced military responsibilities. The pressure was both motivating and overwhelming. Maya felt the weight of representation, the burden of having to succeed not just for herself, but for every woman who would follow in her footsteps. It was a responsibility that male soldiers never had to carry, an additional challenge that complicated what should have been a straightforward assessment of individual capability. But as Maya prepared for the evaluation week, cleaning her equipment, and reviewing tactical scenarios and pushing her physical training to peak intensity, she found herself thinking about her great-aunt Rose and the stories of women who had served in previous generations. They had faced similar challenges with fewer resources and less institutional support, carving out space for future generations through quiet excellence and stubborn persistence. "Mia," she could almost hear Rose's voice saying, "the uniform doesn't make you a soldier. The soldier makes the uniform mean something." Maya understood that the upcoming evaluation would test more than her individual qualifications. It would test whether the military's commitment to merit-based advancement was stronger than its adherence to traditional assumptions about who belonged in positions of leadership. It would test whether 18 months of consistent superior performance had earned her the credibility to be evaluated on her actual capabilities rather than stereotypes about her limitations. The outcome would determine not just Maya's career trajectory, but also the message sent to other women considering military service. Would they see an institution that recognized and rewarded excellence regardless of gender? Or would they see a system that created additional obstacles for female soldiers while maintaining that equal treatment was already the standard? As Maya settled into her bunk on the night before evaluation week began, she felt the familiar weight of the silver medal in her footlocker, a tangible reminder of the women who had served before her and the soldiers who would serve after her. Tomorrow would begin a week that could validate 18 months of preparation or confirm the skeptics who had been waiting for her to fail. But tonight, Maya allowed herself a moment of quiet confidence. She had prepared as thoroughly as possible, had honed her skills to their sharpest edge, had documented her competence through consistent superior performance. Whatever obstacles the evaluation might present, she would meet them with the same combination of technical excellence and stubborn determination that had carried her through every previous challenge. The question wasn't whether Maya Chen was ready for the evaluation. The question was whether the evaluation was ready for Maya Chen. The morning of the comprehensive evaluation dawned with the particular stillness that precedes significant events, when even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Maya woke at 0430 hours, 15 minutes earlier than usual, not from nervousness but from the kind of heightened alertness that came with knowing that today would provide answers to questions that had been building for 18 months. She performed her morning ritual with extra precision, 30 seconds holding her great-aunt Rose's silver medal, 30 seconds reviewing her mental checklist, 30 seconds of focused breathing that centered her mind and aligned her intentions. The familiar weight of the medal felt different this morning, less like a burden of representation and more like a source of strength passed down through generations of women who had faced their own moments of truth in uniform. The first phase of evaluation was individual marksmanship, and Maya arrived at the firing range to discover that her carbine assignment had been corrected overnight. Master Sergeant Davis handed her the weapon she'd been using for the past 16 months, the familiar rifle with the smooth trigger pull and perfectly aligned sights that she'd maintained with obsessive care. Administrative error yesterday, Davis explained, his tone carefully neutral but his eyes carrying a message of quiet support. Wanted to make sure everyone had their assigned equipment for the evaluation. Maya nodded her thanks and began her pre-firing inspection with the methodical attention that had become second nature. But as she worked, she noticed Colonel Reeves positioned at the observation deck with a small group of senior officers she didn't recognize, visitors whose presence suggested that this evaluation carried more significance than a routine assessment of company personnel. Captain Hawkins took his position as primary evaluator, with the kind of formal bearing that indicated he understood he was being observed by his superiors. His instructions to the assembled soldiers were delivered in crisp, professional tones that contrasted sharply with the casual condescension he'd displayed during previous training exercises. Today's marksmanship evaluation will consist of the standard qualification course, followed by an advanced scenario that will test your ability to engage multiple targets under time pressure, he announced. Each phase will be scored independently, with the combined results determining your overall marksmanship rating. Maya settled into her shooting position with the calm confidence that came from having fired this exact course hundreds of times. The familiar weight of her carbine, the precise alignment of the iron sights, the controlled rhythm of her breathing, everything felt aligned and ready. She had trained for this moment not just during her 18 months of military service, but throughout a lifetime of learning to excel in spaces that questioned her right to be there. The first phase proceeded exactly as Maya had expected. 16 rounds, 4 different distances, targets that presented varying levels of difficulty. Her shots landed with the mechanical precision that documented practice creates, each round finding its mark with the kind of accuracy that left no room for subjective interpretation. When the ceasefire command echoed across the range, Maya knew she had fired a perfect score before the targets were even retrieved for scoring. Sergeant Chen, perfect score, the range safety officer announced, his voice carrying a note of admiration that seemed genuine rather than surprised. Around her, Maya heard murmurs of respect from other soldiers, the kind of acknowledgement that superior performance eventually earned, even from skeptics. But Captain Hawkins' response carried a different tone. "Well done, Sergeant," he said, his words technically complimentary, but delivered with the inflection of someone who had expected this outcome and found it somehow problematic rather than praiseworthy. "Let's see how you perform when the pressure increases." The advanced scenario that followed pushed beyond standard qualification requirements into territory that tested not just marksmanship but tactical decision-making under stress. Multiple targets would appear at random intervals and distances. Soldiers would have to identify threats, prioritize engagement sequences, and maintain accuracy while adapting to changing conditions. Maya approached this challenge with the same systematic preparation she brought to every aspect of military service. She reviewed the range layout, identified potential target locations, and developed contingency plans for different scenarios that might unfold. This was the kind of complex problem-solving that engaged both her technical skills and her strategic thinking, exactly the type of challenge she had joined the military to face. The scenario began with a single target at 100 meters, followed by 2 simultaneous targets at different distances, then a sequence of multiple threats that required rapid target acquisition and precise shot placement. Maya moved through the sequence with fluid efficiency, her carbine tracking from target to target with the kind of seamless precision that indicated complete integration between mind, body, and weapon. When the final target fell, Maya had achieved something remarkable even by her own high standards. 16 rounds fired, 16 direct hits, across multiple targets at varying distances under time pressure. It was the kind of performance that would have been noteworthy coming from any soldier in the company, but coming from the female sergeant whose competence had been systematically questioned, it carried additional significance. The silence that followed was broken by spontaneous applause from the other soldiers on the firing line. Tommy Matsuda and Private Rodriguez led the recognition, but it spread quickly through the group. Even soldiers who had previously seemed skeptical of Maya's abilities were acknowledging the undeniable evidence of exceptional marksmanship. Colonel Reeves stepped forward from the observation deck, her movement decisive and purposeful. She approached Maya's shooting position with the bearing of a senior officer who had seen something that demanded immediate attention. "Sergeant Chen," Colonel Reeves said, her voice carrying across the firing range with clarity that ensured everyone could hear. "In 30 years of military service, I have rarely witnessed shooting of that caliber. That was not just excellent marksmanship, that was a demonstration of complete mastery of your weapon and your craft." Maya felt a flush of pride that went beyond personal achievement. This wasn't just recognition of her individual performance. It was validation of 18 months of persistent excellence in the face of constant skepticism. Colonel Reeves' public acknowledgement carried the weight of institutional authority, providing official confirmation of what Maya's performance had been demonstrating all along. But even as Maya accepted the colonel's praise with appropriate military bearing, she noticed Captain Hawkins' reaction to this recognition. His face had taken on a tight expression that suggested displeasure rather than pride in one of his soldiers' achievements. The response revealed something important about the dynamics that had been shaping Maya's experience. Her success wasn't just being minimized, it was being resented. The revelation came into sharper focus during the afternoon's leadership evaluation phase. Soldiers were presented with tactical scenarios and asked to develop solutions that demonstrated their decision-making abilities, communication skills, and potential for command responsibilities. Maya approached these exercises with the same methodical preparation that characterized all her military work, drawing on her engineering background and her extensive study of military doctrine to craft comprehensive responses. Her first scenario involved coordinating a multi-unit response to a simulated enemy attack. Maya's solution demonstrated understanding of both tactical principles and practical logistics, accounting for variables that other soldiers had overlooked and presenting her analysis with the kind of clear communication that effective leadership required. The evaluating officers, a panel that included Colonel Reeves and several majors from other units, received Maya's briefing with attentive interest. They asked detailed follow-up questions that tested both the depth of her knowledge and her ability to adapt her plans when conditions changed. Maya responded with confidence and precision, treating the questions as opportunities to demonstrate additional competence rather than challenges to her authority. When she completed her presentation, one of the visiting majors made a comment that seemed to surprise even himself. "Sergeant Chen, that was a thorough and sophisticated analysis. Have you considered applying for officer candidate school?" The question landed like a small explosion in the evaluation room. Officer candidate school represented the pathway to commissioned leadership in the military, the route through which exceptional enlisted soldiers could transition to positions of formal command authority. It was the kind of opportunity that recognized not just competence but leadership potential. The military's acknowledgement that a soldier possessed the capabilities necessary for greater responsibilities. Maya felt her heart rate increase, but she kept her voice steady as she responded. "I would be honored to be considered for OCS, sir." Leading soldiers and serving in positions of greater responsibility has always been my career goal. Colonel Reeves made a note on her evaluation form that seemed significantly longer than necessary for a simple performance rating. Around the room, Maya sensed a shift in attention, the kind of recalibration that occurred when people realized they were witnessing someone's transition from competent performer to potential leader. But Captain Hawkins' contribution to the evaluation carried a different message. "Sergeant Chen certainly demonstrates technical competence," he said, his tone carefully measured, "though I do have some concerns about her performance under stress and her ability to earn the respect necessary for effective leadership in combat situations." The critique was delivered with the appearance of professional objectivity, but it contradicted months of documented evidence about Maya's performance under pressure. Colonel Reeves looked up from her notes with an expression that suggested she was hearing something that didn't align with her own observations. "Captain Hawkins," Colonel Reeves said, her voice carrying the authority of someone seeking clarification, "could you elaborate on these concerns?" Sergeant Chen's file indicates consistently superior performance in all areas of evaluation. Maya watched Captain Hawkins navigate the delicate territory of justifying his assessment, without appearing to contradict documented evidence. "Ma'am, the sergeant certainly performs well in training exercises, but I question whether that performance would translate to actual combat conditions where leadership requires a different kind of presence and authority." The explanation revealed the subjective nature of the criticism being leveled against Maya. Despite 18 months of superior documented performance, despite scoring higher than her peers on every objective measure of military competence, her potential for leadership was being questioned based on assumptions about how others would respond to her authority rather than evidence of her actual capabilities. Colonel Reeves' response was swift and decisive. "Captain Hawkins, leadership potential should be evaluated based on demonstrated competence, decision-making ability, and performance under stress, all areas where Sergeant Chen has consistently excelled. Personal opinions about theoretical responses from hypothetical subordinates are not appropriate factors in official evaluations." The rebuke was delivered with military courtesy, but unmistakable firmness. Maya realized she was witnessing a confrontation between two different philosophies about how military potential should be assessed, one based on documented performance and objective standards, the other influenced by traditional assumptions about what leadership looked like. The tension in the evaluation room was palpable as other officers absorbed this exchange. Maya understood that she was no longer just a soldier being evaluated. She had become a test case for whether the military's stated commitment to merit-based advancement would override institutional biases that had historically limited opportunities for female soldiers. Major Patricia Williams, one of the visiting officers, broke the silence with a question directed to Maya. "Sergeant Chen, how do you respond to concerns about your ability to command respect in leadership positions?" Maya had been preparing for this question for 18 months, but hearing it asked directly in an official evaluation still felt like a physical blow. She took a breath and drew on every conversation with her great-aunt Rose, every story about women who had earned respect through competence rather than waiting for it to be granted. "Ma'am," Maya replied, "I believe respect in military leadership comes from demonstrating competence, making sound decisions under pressure, and consistently putting the mission and the welfare of soldiers ahead of personal interests. My performance record indicates my ability to meet these standards. If soldiers under my command judge my leadership based on factors other than my professional competence, that reflects their limitations, not mine." The answer was both diplomatic and direct, acknowledging the reality of bias while refusing to accept it as a legitimate limitation on her opportunities for advancement. Maya could see approval in Colonel Reeves' expression and thoughtful consideration in the faces of the other evaluating officers. But the most revealing response came from Captain Hawkins, whose visible frustration suggested that Maya's composed professionalism was undermining his attempts to portray her as unsuitable for leadership responsibilities. His subsequent questions carried an increasingly sharp edge, as if he were trying to provoke the kind of emotional reaction that would validate his concerns about her temperament. "Sergeant Chen," he said, his tone taking on a prosecutorial quality. "Military leadership sometimes requires making unpopular decisions and enforcing discipline, even when subordinates resist. How confident are you in your ability to command obedience from soldiers who might question your authority?" Maya recognized the trap embedded in the question. Any display of assertiveness would be interpreted as evidence of the emotional tendencies that Captain Hawkins had been highlighting. Any expression of uncertainty would confirm his doubts about her leadership potential. She needed to thread the needle between confidence and humility while addressing concerns that revealed more about the questioner's biases than about her actual capabilities. "Sir," Maya replied, "military authority ultimately derives from the uniform and the rank structure, not from personal characteristics. Soldiers who understand military discipline will respond to lawful orders regardless of who issues them. Soldiers who don't understand military discipline represent a training and leadership challenge that any competent officer should be prepared to address through appropriate channels." The response demonstrated both understanding of military culture and confidence in her ability to operate within it. Maya had avoided claiming that respect would be automatic, while also refusing to accept that disrespect would be inevitable. She had positioned the question as one of military professionalism rather than personal authority. Colonel Reeves nodded approvingly and made another extensive note on her evaluation form. The other officers seemed satisfied with Maya's response, but Captain Hawkins appeared increasingly isolated in his skepticism about her leadership potential. The final phase of evaluation involved a practical leadership exercise, where soldiers were given command of small units and tasked with completing tactical objectives. Maya found herself leading a squad of 8 soldiers, including 2 who had previously questioned her competence, Corporal Stevens and Specialist Patterson. The mission required coordinating movement through difficult terrain, establishing defensive positions, and adapting to changing conditions as the scenario evolved. Maya approached the challenge with the same systematic methodology she brought to every military task, but with the added awareness that her performance was being evaluated, not just for technical competence, but for the indefinable qualities that constituted leadership potential. From the beginning, Maya established clear communication protocols, assigned specific responsibilities to each squad member, and created contingency plans for likely complications. Her instructions were precise, but not inflexible, detailed but not micromanaging. She positioned herself where she could observe the entire squad's movement, while remaining available for consultation and adjustment as conditions required. The first test came when Corporal Stevens began to challenge her tactical decisions, questioning her route selection and suggesting alternative approaches that would have unnecessarily exposed the squad to simulated enemy fire. Maya recognized this as both a legitimate military scenario — subordinates would sometimes disagree with leadership decisions — and a personal test of her ability to maintain authority in the face of resistance. "Corporal Stevens," Maya said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that effective leadership required, "I've considered the alternative approaches you're suggesting. The route I've selected minimizes our exposure while maintaining our timeline for reaching the objective. Unless you have information about enemy positions that I don't have, we'll proceed as planned." The response was firm without being defensive, open to legitimate input while maintaining clear command authority. Stevens seemed surprised by the directness of Maya's leadership style, perhaps expecting the kind of hesitant or emotional response that would have validated his skepticism about female officers. When Stevens continued to press his disagreement, Maya escalated her response appropriately. "Corporal, You've presented your tactical assessment, and I've made my decision based on all available information. Your job now is to execute the mission as planned. Is that clear? Clear, Sergeant, Stevens replied, his tone indicating that he understood the conversation was over. The exchange had been witnessed by the entire squad, and by the evaluating officers, who were observing the exercise. Maya had demonstrated the ability to maintain command authority while remaining professional and focused on mission accomplishment. She had neither escalated unnecessarily nor backed down from legitimate challenges. To her leadership. As the exercise continued, Maya's tactical decisions proved sound and her leadership style proved effective. The squad reached all objectives on schedule, adapted successfully to unexpected complications, and completed the mission with the kind of coordinated efficiency that indicated effective command and control. When the exercise concluded, Major Williams approached Maya with an expression of genuine admiration. Sergeant Chen, that was textbook small unit leadership. Your communication was clear, your decisions were sound, and your command presence was exactly what we look for in potential officers. Maya felt a surge of satisfaction that went beyond personal achievement. This wasn't just recognition of her individual performance. It was validation of 18 months of persistent excellence in the face of systematic skepticism. It was proof that competence could overcome assumption, that merit could transcend bias, that the uniform really could make room for anyone capable of wearing it with honor. But even as Maya accepted the praise with appropriate military bearing, she noticed Captain Hawkins' reaction to this recognition. His expression had shifted from skeptical evaluation to something approaching resignation, as if he were witnessing the collapse of assumptions he'd held for years about who belonged in positions of military leadership. The revelation that would change everything came during the final evaluation briefing, when Colonel Reeves requested a private meeting with Maya to discuss her performance and potential career opportunities. They met in the colonel's office, a space that reflected 30 years of military service through photographs, commendations, and the kind of personal touches that made even official spaces feel human. Sergeant Chen, Colonel Reeves began, your performance during this evaluation was exceptional by any standard. Your marksmanship scores were perfect, your tactical knowledge was comprehensive, and your leadership demonstration was exactly what we look for in candidates for advanced training and promotion. Maya felt her heart rate increase as she sensed the significance of what the colonel was preparing to say. After 18 months of navigating skepticism and managing bias, she was finally receiving the kind of unqualified recognition that she had earned through consistent superior performance. Ma'am, serving in positions of greater responsibility has always been my goal, Maya replied. I'm grateful for any opportunities to continue developing my leadership capabilities and contributing to the mission. Colonel Reeves nodded and opened a file folder that contained what appeared to be official documentation. Sergeant Chen, I'm recommending you for immediate promotion to Staff Sergeant and inclusion in the next Officer Candidate School class. Your performance indicates leadership, potential that the military needs to develop and utilize. The words landed with the impact of a life-changing moment. Officer Candidate School represented validation of everything Maya had worked toward, recognition that her capabilities extended beyond technical competence into the realm of leadership, potential that the military valued most highly. But Colonel Reeves wasn't finished. I'm also recommending that you be transferred to a different unit for your continued development. Captain Hawkins' evaluation contained several concerns about your performance that are not supported by documented evidence or by my own observations. Maya felt her stomach tighten as she realized what the colonel was implying. The pattern of substandard equipment assignments, biased performance critiques, and systematic undermining hadn't been invisible to senior leadership. Colonel Reeves had been documenting evidence of institutional bias that Maya had been experiencing, but had been unable to formally address. Ma'am, Maya said carefully. "I've tried to focus on performance rather than on interpersonal dynamics. But I appreciate your recognition of the challenges I've faced." "Sergeant Chen," Colonel Reeves replied, her voice taking on the tone of someone sharing hard-won wisdom. "Focusing on performance is exactly the right approach. But institutional leadership has a responsibility to ensure that exceptional soldiers aren't held back by the limitations of their immediate supervisors." The conversation revealed that Maya's situation had been noticed and evaluated by leaders who understood the difference between legitimate criticism and systematic bias. Colonel Reeves had been watching, documenting, and preparing to intervene in ways that Maya hadn't realized were possible. "There's something else," Colonel Reeves continued. "Your marksmanship performance today was witnessed by representatives from the Army Marksmanship Unit. They've expressed interest in evaluating you for possible inclusion in competitive shooting programs that could lead to international competition opportunities." Maya felt overwhelmed by the sudden transformation of her prospects. After 18 months of fighting for basic recognition of her competence, she was being offered opportunities that exceeded her most ambitious career goals. The military that had seemed determined to underestimate her potential was now opening doors to advancement that she hadn't even known existed. "Ma'am, I would be honored to be considered for any of these opportunities," Maya said, struggling to maintain professional composure while processing the magnitude of what was being offered. Colonel Reeves smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully identified and developed talent that others had failed to recognize. "Sergeant Chen, the military's greatest asset is human potential. Our job as leaders is to identify that potential and create opportunities for it to flourish. Your performance during this evaluation demonstrated potential that we need to nurture and develop." As Maya left Colonel Reeves' office with official documentation of her promotion and recommendations for advanced training, she felt the complex emotions that accompany vindication after long struggle. Relief at finally receiving recognition mixed with frustration at how long recognition had taken to arrive. Pride in her achievements combined with anger at the obstacles that had been placed in her path. But the strongest emotion was gratitude, not just for the opportunities being offered, but for the leadership that had recognized her potential and acted to support it. Colonel Reeves represented the military at its best, an institution committed to developing human capability regardless of the preconceptions that might limit that development. The news of Maya's promotion and recommendations spread quickly through the company, generating reactions that revealed the fault lines that had been present throughout her 18 months of service. Tommy Matsuda and Private Rodriguez celebrated with unrestrained enthusiasm, their joy reflecting months of witnessing Maya's excellence and hoping for recognition that had seemed unlikely to arrive. Other soldiers responded with the kind of respectful acknowledgement that exceptional performance eventually earned, even from skeptics. Specialist Jackson approached Maya after the official announcement to offer congratulations that seemed genuine rather than obligatory. "Chun, you've earned every bit of this recognition. Your shooting today was incredible, and your leadership demonstration was textbook perfect. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel." But Captain Hawkins' response revealed the depth of his resistance to acknowledging Maya's capabilities. Rather than celebrating the success of one of his soldiers, he seemed to interpret Maya's advancement as a personal rebuke of his evaluation methods. His congratulations carried the hollow ring of someone going through required motions without genuine enthusiasm. The contrast between Colonel Reeves' recognition and Captain Hawkins' reaction illustrated the complexity of institutional change. Individual leaders could transcend traditional limitations and create opportunities for exceptional soldiers, regardless of gender or other demographic characteristics. But institutional culture changed slowly, one leader at a time, one decision at a time, one opportunity at a time. Maya realized that her advancement represented more than personal achievement. It was part of a larger transformation in military culture that would create opportunities for future generations of female soldiers. Every woman who succeeded in traditionally male-dominated roles made it easier for the next woman to be evaluated based on performance rather than assumptions. As she prepared for the transition to advanced training and leadership development, Maya thought about the letter she would write to her mother, the first letter she would actually send rather than keeping as a private journal entry. "Dear Mom," she would write, "today I learned that excellence eventually finds recognition, even when that recognition takes longer than it should. I've been promoted to Staff Sergeant and recommended for Officer Candidate School. More importantly, I've learned that the military has leaders who understand the difference between tradition and limitation, who are committed to developing human potential wherever they find it." The letter would continue, "I've also learned that change happens through the accumulated efforts of individuals who refuse to accept that the way things have always been done represents the best way things can be done in the future." Aunt Rose was right when she said that sometimes you have to prove you belong in spaces that weren't designed for you. But she was also right when she said that proving you belong eventually changes what those spaces look like. Maya's advancement represented vindication of 18 months of persistent excellence in the face of systematic skepticism. But it also represented something larger, proof that institutions could evolve, that merit could overcome assumption, that the uniform really could expand to accommodate anyone capable of wearing it with honor and distinction. 6 months after her promotion to Staff Sergeant and acceptance into Officer Candidate School, Maya Chen stood before formation of new recruits at Fort Benning, Georgia, wearing the gold bars of a second lieutenant and carrying the same carbine that had become an extension of her identity as a soldier. The weapon bore new scratches and wear marks from advanced training exercises, but it retained the precision that had made her marksmanship legendary throughout her previous unit. The recruits before her represented the newest generation of soldiers entering military service, young men and women from every corner of America, united by their decision to serve something larger than themselves, but still carrying the assumptions and biases of the civilian world they'd left behind. Maya could see her younger self in their faces, the uncertainty masked by determination, the eagerness to prove themselves worthy of the uniform they wore, the questions about whether they possessed the strength and capability that military service would demand. "Today we begin advanced marksmanship training," Maya announced, her voice carrying the authority that 18 months of experience and systematic development had forged. Marksmanship is not just about shooting accurately, it's about discipline, focus, and the integration of mind and body under pressure. It's about making decisive actions when the consequences matter most. Among the recruits, Maya noticed several who seemed surprised to discover that their marksmanship instructor was a young female lieutenant. She recognized the subtle signs of skepticism that had become familiar during her own journey through military training: the slightly raised eyebrows, the exchanged glances, the body language that suggested they were wondering whether this instructor possessed the credibility to teach them skills they considered essential to their survival. Private Jessica Martinez, positioned in the front row, caught Maya's attention. With her focused intensity and obvious eagerness to excel, Martinez reminded Maya of herself at the beginning of her military journey, physically smaller than most of her male counterparts, but carrying herself with the kind of determination that suggested she had something to prove and the capability to prove it. "Private Martinez," Maya called out, "have you had previous shooting experience?" "Yes, ma'am," Martinez replied with crisp military bearing. "I grew up hunting with my father in Montana. I've been shooting since I was 10 years old." Maya nodded approvingly and made a mental note to watch Martinez's development closely. Experience had taught her that prior shooting knowledge could be either an advantage or a liability, depending on whether the recruit could adapt civilian skills to military requirements, and accept instruction that might contradict techniques they'd learned elsewhere. The morning's training proceeded with the familiar rhythm of military instruction: demonstration, explanation, practice, correction, and repetition until complex skills became automatic responses. Maya moved among the recruits with the confidence of someone who had mastered not just the technical aspects of marksmanship, but the pedagogical skills necessary to transfer that knowledge to others. But the real test came when Private David Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname, challenged her expertise with the kind of casual dismissiveness that Maya had encountered throughout her military career. "Ma'am," Private Chen said during a pause in instruction, "I've heard that female shooters tend to have different techniques because of physiological differences. Should we be adjusting our stance and grip to account for those differences?" The question was phrased as legitimate inquiry, but Maya recognized the subtext. Private Chen was suggesting that her instruction might be inappropriate for male soldiers because it was based on techniques adapted for female physical characteristics. The implication was that her expertise was gender-specific rather than universally applicable. Maya felt the familiar tightening in her chest that accompanied these moments of testing. But 18 months of experience had taught her how to transform challenge into teaching opportunity. She had learned that the most effective response to skepticism was not argument, but demonstration. "Private Chen," Maya replied, her voice maintaining instructional calm. "Effective marksmanship principles are based on physics, biomechanics, and human psychology, none of which vary significantly by gender. However, since you've raised the question, let's use this as an opportunity for practical demonstration." Maya moved to the firing line and assumed her shooting position with the fluid motion that had become second nature. Around her, the recruits fell silent as they recognized that they were about to witness something significant. Even Private Chen seemed to realize that his question had created a moment where theory would be tested by performance. "The target at 100 meters has been marked with 16 separate scoring zones," Maya announced, her voice carrying clearly across the firing range. "I'm going to demonstrate the effectiveness of proper marksmanship technique by engaging each zone in sequence, using the same principles I've been teaching you." Maya settled into her stance with the complete focus that had characterized her shooting since childhood. The desert wind at Fort Benning felt different from the California breezes where she'd learned to shoot, but the fundamental relationship between shooter and target remained constant across geography and circumstance. First shot struck the upper left scoring zone with precision that drew murmurs of appreciation from the watching recruits. Maya didn't pause to observe the impact. She was already transitioning to the second target zone, her breathing controlled, her trigger finger moving with the mechanical consistency that thousands of practice rounds had developed. Shot after shot landed exactly where Maya intended, each round finding its designated scoring zone with the kind of accuracy that transcended lucky shooting and demonstrated complete mastery of the weapon system. The recruits watched in silence that gradually transformed from skeptical attention to genuine awe as Maya's demonstration continued without error or hesitation. When the 16th shot completed the sequence, Maya lowered her carbine and turned to face the formation. The target's downrange provided undeniable evidence of shooting that exceeded military standards by margins that made discussion of technique variations irrelevant. The morning sun cast long shadows across Arlington National Cemetery as General Alexandra Chun Martinez Kim, Maya's great-great-granddaughter, approached Section 60, where 4 generations of military women rested beneath white marble headstones. She carried with her a small wooden box, its contents unchanged despite passing through 5 generations of military service. Alexandra had never met her ancestor Maya, who had died peacefully at age 93, but Maya's influence had shaped every aspect of her military career in ways both obvious and subtle. The uniform Alexandra wore bore insignia that would have been unimaginable to Maya's generation, not because women couldn't earn them, but because the positions they represented hadn't existed when gender was still considered a limitation. Rather than simply one characteristic among many, the cemetery was quiet except for the distant sound of a military funeral taking place near the tomb of the unknown soldier. Alexandra knelt beside Maya's headstone, its simple inscription reading, General Maya Chen, United States Army, 1985 to 2078. She proved the uniform belongs to anyone worthy of wearing it. Great-great-grandmother, Alexandra said quietly, I wanted you to know what became of the foundation you built. Alexandra opened the wooden box and removed its contents. The photograph of Elena, working in the Sacramento electronics factory. The letter from David describing his hope that his daughter would have opportunities he couldn't imagine. And the silver medal that had belonged to Rose Chen, Maya's great-aunt who had served as a combat medic in Vietnam. But the box now contained additional items that chronicled a century of progress built on Maya's example. Letters from the first female chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, thanking Maya posthumously for creating the precedent that made such advancement possible. Photographs from the dedication of the Maya Chen Leadership Institute at West Point, where cadets of all backgrounds learned the principles that Maya had demonstrated throughout her career. A Medal of Honor awarded to Colonel Sarah Martinez Wong for exceptional valor in combat, an achievement that stood on the foundation of competence-based evaluation that Maya's generation had established. The military you left us has become something you dreamed about, but probably couldn't have imagined. Alexandra continued her one-sided conversation. We've had 3 female presidents, all with military backgrounds. The armed forces have been led by officers from every demographic category imaginable, selected purely on their demonstrated capability. The barriers you broke were so thoroughly demolished that new generations don't even know they once existed. Alexandra's own career illustrated the transformation that Maya's example had catalyzed. As the first director of the newly created Space Defense Command, Alexandra commanded resources and responsibilities that spanned multiple planets and orbital installations. Her selection for the position had been based entirely on her expertise in space-based strategic operations and her demonstrated leadership capability in complex, multi-service environments, the questions that had defined Maya's early career. Whether women could handle military leadership, whether merit-based advancement would compromise unit effectiveness, whether institutional change would weaken military capability, had been answered so definitively that they no longer required discussion. The military Alexandra commanded was stronger, more capable, and more effective than any force in human history, precisely because it utilized the complete spectrum of human talent without artificial limitations. Your carbine is still in the museum, Alexandra said, touching the headstone with the familiarity that came from regular visits. But its real legacy continues every day on training ranges, where new soldiers learn that competence is the only qualification that matters. Alexandra's daughter, Captain Elena Kim Santos, approached through the rows of headstones, carrying her own infant daughter, the 7th generation of Maya's family, to wear the uniform. Elena had chosen to serve in the Army Corps of Engineers, following a career path that would have been unusual for military women in Maya's era, but was simply another specialization option in Alexandra's time. Mom, Elena said as she joined Alexandra beside Maya's grave, I brought the baby to meet her ancestor. Alexandra took her granddaughter, noting how the infant's eyes seemed to focus on the military insignia adorning both women's uniforms. 7 generations of military service had created a family tradition that transcended the barrier-breaking necessity of Maya's era to become simply another way that Americans chose to serve their country. Maya, Alexandra said, addressing the headstone while holding her granddaughter, this is Elena Xin Kim Santos Rodriguez, born last month at Walter Reed. If she chooses military service someday, her decision will be based on personal calling. rather than the need to prove anything about who belongs in uniform. The baby's tiny hand grasped Alexandra's finger with the determination that seemed to run in their family across generations. Alexandra wondered if this newest Elena would choose military service or pursue one of the countless other paths that Maya's generation had opened for American women through their persistent excellence. A honor guard approached through the cemetery, preparing for the changing of the guard at the tomb of the unknown soldier. The soldiers moved with the precision that had characterized American military ceremony for over 2 centuries, but their ranks included men and women from every background, united by their commitment to honoring those who had served before them. Alexandra recognized the guard commander, Colonel David Chen Martinez, Maya's great-nephew whose own military career had benefited from the precedent his ancestor had established. David's presence at Arlington represented the multiplication effect that Maya's achievements had created, not just opening doors for women, but strengthening the entire military institution by ensuring it could identify and develop exceptional talent wherever it appeared. General Chen Martinez Kim, Colonel Chen Martinez said as he approached, using the formal address that protocol required despite their family relationship. I wanted to let you know that we're including Maya's story in next month's leadership seminar at the Pentagon. New officers still study her career as an example of how individual excellence can drive institutional transformation. The conversation illustrated how Maya's legacy had evolved from personal achievement to historical case study to foundational principle of military culture. Her story was taught not as an example of gender barrier breaking, but as a demonstration of how institutions could maximize their effectiveness by focusing on merit rather than assumption. Alexandra's communications device chimed with an encrypted message from Space Defense Command Headquarters, a routine status update from the Mars Defense Station, commanded by General Kim Rodriguez, whose grandmother had served in Maya's first training company at Fort Benning. The message represented the ordinary miracle of progress, communication, from a military installation on another planet, commanded by an officer whose appointment was based purely on her demonstrated expertise in interplanetary defense operations. Maya, Alexandra said, reading the message from Mars, your influence has literally reached other worlds. The principles you established have guided military expansion throughout the solar system. The scope of transformation that Maya's career had catalyzed extended far beyond what any single individual could have imagined. The military institution that had initially questioned whether women could serve effectively had evolved into an organization that led human expansion across multiple planets, commanded by officers selected from the broadest possible talent pool without regard to demographic characteristics. Elena Chen Kim Santos Rodriguez began to fuss in Alexandra's arms, responding to some infant concern that adults couldn't identify. Alexandra walked among the headstones, noting how many bore the names of military women who had served with distinction in conflicts and peacekeeping operations that Maya's generation couldn't have anticipated. The cemetery contained representatives of every war and military operation in American history, but the evolution of the headstones themselves told the story of gradual progress toward genuine equality. Early sections contained few women's graves. Later sections reflected increasing female participation. Recent sections showed complete integration, where gender was simply one characteristic among many that described the diverse Americans who had chosen military service. Look at this, Elena said, pointing to a nearby headstone. General Patricia Santos Kim, first female commandant of the Marine Corps. Her biography says she was inspired to join the Marines after reading about Maya's achievements at Fort Benning. The headstone represented another thread in the complex tapestry of influence that individual excellence could create across generations. Maya's success had inspired Patricia's service, which had opened opportunities for other Marines, which had created precedents for future generations in an endless multiplication of possibility. Alexandra's granddaughter had fallen asleep against. Her chest, peaceful in the quiet atmosphere of the cemetery. The infant's presence represented hope and continuity, another generation of Americans who would grow up in a world where their opportunities were limited only by their capabilities and dedication rather than by artificial barriers based on demographic characteristics. A flight of military aircraft passed overhead, returning to Andrews Air Force Base after a routine patrol mission. The formation included F-35 Lightning fighters, piloted by officers whose selection for aviation training had been based on their aptitude and performance rather than traditional assumptions about who could handle the physical and mental demands of military aviation. "The Air Force has come a long way since your era," Alexandra said to Maya's headstone. "Our newest squadron commanders include pilots from every background imaginable, selected purely on their ability to complete complex missions in challenging environments." The aircraft disappeared into the afternoon haze, leaving contrails that would dissipate within hours. But their passage represented the permanent transformation that Maya's generation had achieved, a military where excellence was the only qualification that mattered, and where American airspace was defended by pilots chosen from the complete spectrum of national talent. Colonel Chen Martinez returned, after completing his ceremonial duties at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. His uniform bore ribbons from peacekeeping operations in 3 different star systems, service that would have been science fiction during Maya's active duty but had become routine responsibility for the military Alexandra commanded. "General," he said, "the Secretary of Defense asked me to remind you about tomorrow's congressional testimony regarding the expansion of military operations to the Jupiter system. Your expertise in space-based strategic operations is considered essential for the committee's understanding of resource requirements." Alexandra's testimony would influence decisions about military expansion that would affect American security interests for decades to come. Her selection to provide this testimony was based on her demonstrated competence in space defense operations, continuing the tradition of merit-based assignment that Maya's career had helped establish. "Maya," Alexandra said as she prepared to leave the cemetery, "tomorrow I'll be explaining to Congress how we can defend American interests throughout the solar system. The questions they'll ask will focus on strategy and capability rather than whether someone like me can handle the responsibility. That's your legacy, making competence the only question that matters." Alexandra carefully placed the contents back in the wooden box, preserving the tangible connections to family history while carrying forward the intangible legacy of excellence and service. The box would eventually pass to her granddaughter, along with the stories and principles that had shaped 6 generations of military service. Elena carried the sleeping baby toward the cemetery entrance, where their driver waited to return them to Pentagon for Alexandra's afternoon meetings with joint service planners. The routine nature of their visit, too. Maya's grave illustrated how completely her example had been integrated into family tradition and military culture. As they walked among the headstones, Alexandra noticed new graves being prepared for military personnel who had died in service to their country during recent peacekeeping operations. The location of these graves throughout the cemetery, without segregation by gender or background, represented the complete integration that Maya's generation had fought to achieve. "She would be proud," Elena said, adjusting the baby's blanket against the afternoon breeze. "She would be satisfied," Alexandra replied, understanding the difference. Pride implied surprise at achievement. Satisfaction suggested the fulfillment of expectations. Maya had expected the military to evolve toward genuine meritocracy because she had faith in American institutions' ability to recognize and correct their own limitations. Their vehicle departed Arlington and crossed the Potomac River toward the Pentagon, where Alexandra would spend the remainder of the afternoon planning military operations that would extend American defensive capabilities to the outer planets. The meetings would include officers from every service branch and background, selected for participation based on their expertise rather than demographic characteristics. The Pentagon building itself had been expanded and modernized since Maya's era, but its fundamental mission remained constant, organizing American military capability to defend national interests in an increasingly complex strategic environment. The difference was that the building now housed a military that utilized the complete spectrum of American talent without artificial limitations. As Alexandra entered the Pentagon for her afternoon meetings, she reflected on the letter she would write that evening, continuing the family tradition that Maya had established of documenting lessons learned for future generations. To the 8th generation of our family who might choose military service, the letter would begin, "You will inherit a military that Maya's generation could only dream about, an institution where merit determines opportunity and where excellence is the only standard that matters. Your job will be to maintain that standard while facing challenges that previous generations couldn't imagine." The letter would continue, "Maya proved that individual excellence could drive institutional transformation. Your generation must prove that institutional transformation can be permanent. The uniform she fought to earn the right to wear now belongs to anyone worthy of wearing it, and that legacy must be preserved for generations yet to come." Alexandra's final thought as she entered the Pentagon was about the young soldiers who were just beginning their military careers in an era when space-based operations were routine assignments rather than science fiction possibilities. They would face challenges that Maya's generation couldn't have anticipated, but they would approach those challenges with the confidence that came from serving in an institution committed to recognizing and developing exceptional talent wherever it appeared. Maya Chen's ultimate victory was not the medal she had earned or the position she had achieved, but the transformed military culture that evaluated soldiers based on their capabilities rather than assumptions about their limitations. Her legacy lived in every military operation successfully completed by diverse teams of officers and enlisted personnel, every promotion earned through demonstrated merit rather than demographic politics, and every young American who chose military service knowing they would be judged by their performance rather than their demographics. The wooden box that had accompanied Maya through her military transformation would continue to pass through generations of military service, carrying forward the tangible connection to family history while preserving the intangible legacy of excellence, integrity, and the conviction that America's military strength came from utilizing the full spectrum of its citizens' talents and dedication. In the end, Maya Chen had achieved immortality not through monuments or memorials, but through the permanent transformation of American military culture that continued to strengthen national defense capabilities more than a century after her birth. Her story had become proof that individual excellence could create institutional change, that persistent performance could overcome systematic skepticism, and that the American military could evolve to embrace anyone capable of wearing the uniform with honor and distinction.